Group by is one of the most powerful Excel functions released in the last few years. But there are lots of things that are either undocumented or not featured in other videos. So we're going to reveal those things in this video, meaning you'll be able to make use of the full power of Group by. So if you're ready, let's get started. In this video, we are using the same data for all of our examples. It's a table with columns for item, region, and size. They are the values that we want to group by. Then we have the values that we want to aggregate, and they are unit and price. We're going to be looking at 4 different examples in this video, the first of which is total depth. We're going to start by building a simple group by function. In cell H4, I'll type equals, group by, opening bracket. For the row fields, we're just going to select our item column. Then for the values, we're going to select our units column. And finally, we have the function that we want to perform. And in this example, we're going to use the sum function. I'll close the bracket and calculate. As you can see, we now have the sum of the units grouped by each item, and we have a total at the bottom. Now, I have already applied conditional formatting to the underlying cells so that when our formula calculates, it will display formatting to make the values easier to read. Here, we have only provided a single column into our row fields argument. We can provide multiple columns. So I will delete our previous selection, and now I'm going to select the item, region, and size columns. When we calculate, our values are now grouped by each of those columns. For example, if we look at our first value of 39, that is made up of all of the items which are alpha, east, and large. Group by has the ability to not just add a total row, but also subtotals. Let's edit our formula. And then we're going to skip over the field headers argument and come to total depth. Here we can see 5 options. 0 is no totals, 1 is grand totals, 2 is grand totals and subtotals, and then we have minus versions if we want to place the grand totals and subtotals at the top. Let's suggest that we want to include subtotals. I'll enter 2. When that calculates, we now get our grand total at the bottom and a subtotal for each of our items. We can see alpha totals 86. But what if we want a subtotal by item and region? If we go back to our formula, you'll notice we only have those 5 options. But we're not restricted to those 5 options. We can enter a number that represents how many columns we have. So I'm going to enter 3. This wasn't an option on that drop down, but when it calculates, we now have our values grouped by item. You can see our total of alpha for 86, but also our regions. And you can see additional subtotals for east, north, and south. And if you're the kind of person who likes to have totals at the top, we can also enter a minus version of that number and calculate. And now we have our grand total, subtotal, and subtotal above the breakdown of those values. That means we can have as many layers of subtotal depth as we wish in Group by. We're not restricted to the options in the drop-down. The next feature we're looking at is field relationship. Let's start by building a simple group by. I'll type equals, group by, opening bracket. For our row fields, we want item and region. Then for our values, we're going to select units. And then for our function, we're going to use sum. I'll close the bracket and calculate. The default value for the columns in the row fields is ascending order. But we have an optional argument to sort by a different order. Let's skip over field headers. We'll skip over total depth. And let's come to sort order. In there, we can enter a column number and also a direction. If we enter -1, that will sort by column 1 in descending order. Let's take a look at that. You can see our values are now in the order of Delta, Charlie, Bravo, and Alpha. But what happens if we want to sort by the second column. Let's edit our formula and let's use -2. So that will be our second column in descending order. When we calculate that, you can see that we don't get those columns in that order. Instead, they are grouped by their parent hierarchy. For example, in alpha, we have south, north, and east. That is descending alphabetically. Then in Bravo, we have west and north, which is also descending alphabetically. That means the sort occurs inside its parent item. But this is where we have our field relationship argument. Let's edit our formula. We will skip over our filter array, and then we come to field relationship. The interesting thing about this argument is that when group by was initially released, this argument didn't exist. Therefore, lots of the videos which talk about group by don't include this argument. But after it was released into beta, this argument was added to the function before it was made generally available. Now, what does this argument do? We have two options. Hierarchy, this is the default. This means the fields are a part of a hierarchy and subtotals may be shown. Or we can use 1, which means table. The fields are not part of a hierarchy and subtotals cannot be shown. Now this may sound confusing, so let's just take a look to see what table does. I'll enter 1, close the bracket and calculate. And as you can see, the region is now in descending order. We have west, south, north, and east. We are no longer sorting with inside the parent hierarchy, and that is the purpose of the field relationship argument. Now, we should note that this argument only works if we are using the total depth of 0, 1, or -1. Once we add a subtotal, we are no longer able to override the hierarchy of our output. So, field relationship is one of those features which is now documented. But because it was changed between beta and general availability, most videos about group by don't include it. The next feature we're going to look at is custom headings. Let's start by building a basic group by equals group by, opening bracket. For our row fields, we're going to use our item column. Then for our values, we're going to select the units and the price column. Next, we're going to have a function of sum. I'll close that and calculate, which means we now have our grouping by item. We have the sum of the units and also the sum of the price. But we're not restricted to a single calculation. Let's edit our formula, and rather than just using sum, we're going to hstack. That means we're going to stack two functions together, and we're going to use sum and also average. I'll close the bracket, I'll calculate, and now we get the sum of the units and the average price. But we don't know which columns these calculations relate to. All we see is sum and average. But there is an undocumented feature of group by which allows us to add our own custom headings. Let's edit our formula. To add our custom headings, we need to provide a two-dimensional array rather than a single-dimensional array. Because we're using hstack, we can use vstack. That means it will stack these values vertically. For the first row, we have the hstack of sum and average. We can now create another hstack, and this will contain the names that we want to use. Let's use total units and also average price. I'll close the hstack, I'll close the vstack, and then when we calculate, we now get our own custom headings. It no longer displays sum and average, it now displays total units and average price. So if you ever have automatic headings based on the functions performed on the values, remember you can change them, but this feature is not documented anywhere. The final feature we're looking at is the values passed into the function argument. Let's create a basic group by function once again, equals group by, opening bracket. For the row fields, we're going to use the item column. Then for the values, we're going to use the units. And for the function, let's use sum. I'll close the bracket and calculate, And that now gives us the sum of the units grouped by each item. The thing is that the sum function is what's known as eta reduction. It's a simplified version of what happens in the background. So let's edit our formula and we're going to build our full sum function. What happens in the background is that for each item, it filters our table and only returns those specific units. And then it sums those values. That means that in terms of a function, what's happening is that we are summing the group of values. Now we can't commit the formula in this state because group doesn't mean anything. What happens is that group by passes those values into the function argument. Therefore, we need to create a function to tell group by that group is the name that we want to use for those values. To do that, we use lambda and then we use the name of group. That is now the full function syntax. So anytime we see just sum or average or min or max, what's happening is that we have a lambda of the group of items and then those values are passed across into that function. But as a simplified syntax, we can simply use sum. Now if we calculate this function, we get exactly the same result. And this is exactly the same result. Excel would take our sum function and then expand it to the full lambda syntax before it then continues with the remainder of the calculation. But here's the interesting thing. For each item, group by doesn't just pass across the group of values. It also passes across all the values. The first values passed are the group and the second values passed is all the values. Therefore, we can edit our formula and add an additional parameter. Let's add a parameter called all. Now that we have those two values, we can use both of them in our calculation. Let's use an ampersand and then a slash in double quotes followed by another ampersand, and we want to sum all the values. I'll close that bracket and calculate. And now we get two values. For alpha, we can see the total is 86 out of 143. For Bravo, we can see it's 31 out of 143. Now for the total row, that group contains all of those items. Therefore, it's 143 as the group, but also 143 as the all. Now, what happens if we add subtotals? Let's edit our formula. And for our total depth, we're going to enter 2. I'll close that bracket. But we've currently only got a single column. So let's remove item and let's include item and region. I'll close that bracket and calculate. We can see what each individual element is out of the total, but we can also see the subtotal. So alpha is still 86 out of 143, but alpha and east is 60 of that 143. Now, if we want to calculate a percentage, we could edit our formula. I'll remove the double quotes and the ampersands. Now, when we calculate, I do just need to edit our numbers and change them into percentages. There we go. We now have the percentage that the group is of the total. At the same time as releasing the group by function, Microsoft also released the percent of function, which means we don't need to calculate our function by summing the group and the all. Instead, we could use percent of. I'll use that as the function. Percent of has two arguments, the data subset and the data all. Therefore, we can enter our group as our data subset and our all as the data all. Let's now calculate, and as you can see, we get exactly the same result. So, because our first parameter of group is passed into the first argument of the function, and our second parameter of all is passed into the second argument of the function, we can once again use eta reduction. We can remove this lambda element. I will also remove the values in the brackets. And when that calculates, once again, we get the same result. And that's because group by is passing two values into our function. The first value is the subset of values for the item, and then the second value is all the items from the entire table. This feature is partially documented, but not for group by. It's included as a note to the relative to argument of the pivot by function, which means we really have to go looking for it. But this technique applies not just to pivot by, but also to group by. And they are the 4 unknown features of group by. Firstly, we can have any subtotal depth number that we need. Secondly, field relationships allow us to sort outside of a hierarchy. Thirdly, we can create custom headings to replace function names as headings. And finally, group by passes 2 arrays into the function, the group of values and all the values. If you learned something new from this video, then why not subscribe and get notifications so you don't miss any of our future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.